Starbucks is back to the cafeteria and the third place that made Starbucks famous.
Blah,
and
blah, blah.
They're complaining, why aren't they opening more drive-thrus? That's what's booming. I don't know what this guy, the new CEO, is thinking, but I have a feeling that he said, don't want to compete in that market. I want to compete in the market with people that really want the experience, the cafe experience, and therefore that's why I'm investing more in the cafe experience and forgetting about what the previous CEO was trying to do, is like cater for everybody. So I guess they're finding their niche, which we'll see if it works or not, right? But I think that is the clear definition of what a strategy is. He's made a decision of what he wants to cater for, and what type of consumer I want to cater to, right? That it's in my opinion a smart move. I don't know if they'll have a second chance or a third chance. If their customers will give them that third chance, I don't know. That's a different story. But at least he is making a very clear choice.
Map It Forward is starting a monthly online video discussion group for serious people in the coffee industry for just $20 a month. If you're looking for a place to connect with other individuals and explore a wide variety of topics about the challenges and solutions needed to navigate the many layers of the coffee crisis, this is for you. This space is a new feature for our top tier patrons in our Patreon community. Who are the kinds of people who are already signed up to be a part of this group? Think of the people who are guests on this podcast, and that should give you an idea of the caliber of what to expect. This is not a panel discussion. This is a direct, open discussion group facilitated by me. A great place to network, a great place to explore ideas, a great place to come up with solutions. To join this supportive and engaging monthly online meetup, head to patreon.com/mapitforward and choose the $20 tier. For details, check the show notes. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 4 of a really awesome 5-part series with Alejandro from Caravela Coffee. We are talking about the year in coffee in 2025. And in this episode, we're going to talk about generating value for stakeholders in the long term. And something where I want to start this conversation is similar to where we left off. And I guess it's the value proposition of coffee to the market. And I think what we're starting to see is that people are reassessing the value proposition of coffee to the market. Would you agree, Alejandro?
Absolutely. Yes, 100%. I think that is part of what is happening. And that's thanks in part to the repositioning of the C market. That makes you think harder. Okay, if no coffee is cheap anymore, what is value, right? Because in the past there was cheap coffee and there was expensive coffee. Now everything is expensive. Like if you base it at the $1 level that we were so used to in the past. So even in Brazil, it's expensive.
Yeah. And people are really nervous right now because when we're saying even in Brazil is expensive, is that permanent? Is that, this goes back to what we were talking about before. Is this a new consciousness that we're programming into the industry? And what I wonder is, as we look at this continuing to move on, and I expect this will continue to move on into 2026, we'll talk more about that in the next episode, but we're going to start to see an eventual culling of businesses that had built their businesses on cheap coffee. And this is where I expect what we're going to start to see is this middle of it carving out. But we've talked about that. But what I'm wondering is as things move on, what is the new value that we have to decide on defining in coffee? If we're not, because we can't say it's not on price. It's absolutely on price. But what is the value that we communicate across the value chain about coffee? Because we used to think it was specialty versus commercial. I'm not sure that that's the value proposition anymore. Is it?
It's a good thought. It's just coffee in the end, and for most consumers, it's just coffee, right? They can't tell the huge difference between commercial and specialty. Especially you add sugar and milk and those things, the differences become very blurry. So I guess I would agree with your assessment that what is the value of coffee is going to continue to change, right? Um, it really depends on which consumer you ask, right? I would think that some consumers want consistency. That's what they value. I want a consistent experience because it's a beverage. I don't want it to taste bitter one day and sweet the next day. I want it to be the same. If it's always taste bitter, that's what I expect and that's what I want. If it's always tastes sweet, that's what I want. I don't want it to constantly change. For some others, it might be more the social aspects of coffee, and for others, it might be the environmental aspects of coffee. I think that in the end is something that each roaster retailer needs to kind of decide what they want, what kind of value they want to add, and find a niche market for that, for their own value proposition, right? In the end, what's happening in coffee, they all want to target the same. And that's the problem.
Customer. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you're right.
So you have to choose which market you want to cater for. You can't choose everything. That is not a strategy to begin with. And second of all, it's a terrible way of thinking because you can't meet everybody in their same place, right? So people and businesses need to start to think more strategically and choose what their audience is. People are saying Starbucks is back to the cafeteria and the third place that made Starbucks famous.
Blah,
and
blah, blah.
They're complaining, why aren't they opening more drive-thrus? That's what's booming. I don't know what this guy, the new CEO, is thinking, but I have a feeling that he said, don't want to compete in that market. I want to compete in the market with people that really want the experience, the cafe experience, and therefore that's why I'm investing more in the cafe experience and forgetting about what the previous CEO was trying to do, is that cater for everybody. So I guess they're finding their niche, which we'll see if it works or not, right? But I think that is the clear definition of what a strategy is. He's made a decision of what he wants to cater for, and what type of consumer I want to cater to, right? That it's in my opinion a smart move. I don't know if they'll have a second chance or a third chance. If their customers will give them that third chance, I don't know. That's a different story. But at least he is making a very clear choice.
Being definitive.
Yes, and that's the same thing that happens if you look at the Big B's and the Seven Brews and the Dutch Brothers. They've decided that their market is that middle American market that drives everywhere, that commutes long distances. That is my market, and I want to cater for that market. And that's why they're being successful, because they chose their market very clearly, and they've been very clear to the consumer. If you are the commuter and wants to get a coffee in your coffee, here I am.
How about the producer? Because I'm wondering if they're making more of their decisions about producing based on pricing or based on the value proposition they have to the market. I'm sure it's not homogenous, right? Like everyone's making different decisions. But what are you guys seeing with regards to the producer? Are they turning around and reassessing their idea around, I'm not sure that specialty is working for the producer anymore?
You're right. So I think I would say 50-50. 50% of the producers that we used to work with in 2023, 2022, I've made the decision and said, hey, I don't need to worry anymore about quality. The price I get is good enough with less effort. So I'll stop producing specialty and I'll focus on the volume and quantity. But we have seen another 50% that says, no, I'm thinking long term. And I want to stick to what's been working for me in the last 10 or 15 years. So you see both camps. But I think it's reassuring that it's not 90-10. For us, it's 50-50, which makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially when you add into it the challenges that people are having around labor. And so this is a natural next step to, a lack of access to labor. But what happens when it starts to shift more in the direction of like the 90-10?
Ooh.
Is this, Yeah.
Well, then we have a problem.
Let me give you the scenario where I see that happening, and you tell me what you think eventuates. The C market goes to $5 and it stays there for more than 10 minutes. Let's say it stays. So right now it's oscillating between $3.50 and $4, near enough to each of them. And it's been doing that for some months. Goes up a little bit further than that, goes a little bit lower than that. But that's the general vicinity. What happens if that starts happening around the $5 mark?
Never thought about that. I think, and again, we're in a very different position than most traders because we do have a very kind of fixed supply chain that we've built over the last 20 years. So we have a lot of loyal, long-standing relationships. So we might not be the best example, but I do have a feeling, and because our model, if the price goes 5, we pay 5 plus. We don't keep our prices in a fixed price. There, we will always have people that will follow us because we follow the market. Our model is about following the market. And it's not just a selfless kind of let's help the farmer kind of mentality. It's
right. Let's build good supply chains. Let's build strong relationships, manage risk.
Yes. Would I ask a farmer to sell me coffee at below market? No. Why would I? Why would a farmer sell to me below market? There's no.
And you don't want them to.
Right. So I think because our model moves with the market, we'll see less churn. But maybe somebody that is selling at a fixed price, Brazilian farmer, for example, that has always sold as a business price, they say, well, I can sell to the cooperative instead of having to worry about my relationship with that Australian buyer that comes to me to visit my farm every year and ask for more things every year, right? That it really depends on where and who your partners are, right? And I guess that's where you have to build systems and business models that are resilient to wherever the market lies, right? Maybe if it lasted 5 years, we'll probably lose a lot more business, right? Maybe we'll just have to shrink our business because a lot of the roasters won't be able to adapt quickly to a $5 market.
Nor will the consumer. Let's be real. The consumer, given the way things are going, and you mentioned that earlier, that the consumer seems rather resilient and they are just paying a little bit more. I'm not sure that they have actually reached the prices for what's happening in the market so far. I'm not sure that the consumer is going to be as resilient as everybody thinks. Folks, if you look at platforms like Klarna, do you know what Klarna is?
Yeah.
There were some recent reports that said, and I'm not going to be exact in this, but it's close. There are recent reports that revealed that a majority, like over 50% of the debt that's on Klarna is people using buy now, pay later schemes to pay for groceries.
Wow.
We've entered a very interesting phase of this economic cycle when people are using debt to pay for groceries and they've gone beyond the credit card, right? They've gone to the next level of debt to pay. And it's somewhere in the order of 60%, 70% of the debts. And they're not using it to buy cameras and luxury or recreational goods. They're using it to buy groceries. And so I think that the consumer is less resilient than what is being reported. So if we see a C market that goes to it finds a new normal for an extended period of time at around $5, I don't know what happens. I'm very keen to understand what that looks like for farmers as well as for traders as well as for roasters, because I'm not sure who that. I guess farmers are all going to look to produce as much coffee as they can, and why would they bother with specialty at that moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then the traders have to carry the risk in that moment and use all the tools that they've got access to help them carry that risk. As that, period of time that you're carrying that risk goes on, are we sure that those roasters are going to be able to stay in business during that time?
Here's an interesting thing. When the market went up to 3, actually to 4 back in March, April, traders stopped buying coffee. That did not happen a month ago when the market went back up to 420.
Oh, really?
Yes.
But it was just there for a blip. It wasn't there for the extended period of time that it was.
But even in the blip of March, April, they did stop buying. They kind of like said, we're not buying, we're closing down, we're shutting our doors for a couple of days or 3 days or a week. This time around, we didn't hear anybody closing when the market went to 420.
Right.
Which gives me the indication that they're now more resilient than they were before. So they've seen it before, and now they were ready for it.
Okay.
I'm just guessing.
So they've got
the house. My educated guess. So in the middle of the Guatemalan, the Mexican and South American harvest, we're in the middle of that. Farmer prices significantly dropped because there's no buyers, and so the farmer prices significantly dropped. This time around, we didn't see it.
But was that artificially? Like what I kept hearing from people saying that there's like the sellers have got together the buyers have got together to stop buying so that they could force the price down. And I don't know. He's shrugging his shoulders.
I don't know. It could have been. I can't. We're not part of that group.
No, but that shit absolutely happens.
Sure.
It completely happens.
Sure.
Yeah.
It probably happened. But this time around, it didn't happen, which is interesting. The behavior changed.
Right.
And that I always think about how people behave, that, how companies behave. That is a good indication of where they're, how they're thinking, right? And so, I'm just speculating here, but, probably they were prepared both in terms of credit, but also in terms of demand, right?
Right.
We are seeing more people kind of like say, okay, I just need to buy coffee, And then maybe it's also because
they're forced into it.
They're now being forced into buying coffee as opposed to 6 months before, where I have plenty of stock. I can't wait. So the circumstances certainly changed, both for the trade and for the entire industry. That's the point.
What I've heard a lot of roasters say, and actually a lot of producers have said this to me as well, that the customers that they used to have can't afford to buy from them anymore. And I've heard roasters say, we can't afford to buy the coffee that we used to be able to buy because the producer has increased the prices. And so we're seeing a reshuffling for sure. We're seeing a reshuffling. Are you seeing some of that reshuffling happening?
Absolutely. Yeah. Not so much in our market again, because we are always about based on the market, but we've heard more and more roasters say Brazilian coffee that I was buying and I paid fixed prices for a long time is now no longer cheap, and that's why I'm looking again at your coffees, because the value that you provide is much more evident now that the price of my alternatives is much higher.
Right. One other thing that we need to talk about in this episode is we talk about like how do we work together to generate value, blah, blah, blah. Something that we haven't spoken about is the role that regenerative agriculture is going to play as we move forward, and particularly building resilient coffee farms that can weather the weather. Never said that before, but that should be a t-shirt. How much are you seeing this, especially as we look at things like EUDR that turned out to be a thing that everyone was preparing for 2 years in a row, that has again been anticlimactic, right? It's being delayed. You look like the look on your face, Alejandro. Folks, if you're not watching, he's closing his eyes. He's gone to a Zen garden somewhere in the corners of his mind. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a lot of talk and there's not enough walk in the regenerative arena. I wish it was the opposite. I wish there was a lot more action, but we're not seeing it. And maybe, and this is a big caveat, maybe because most of our farmers were already regenerative. If
working on it.
Well, most of our farmers do not apply that much fertilizer. They apply very artisan practices. And more especially like in most of the countries. Colombia is a different kind of story. We see all sorts of shades, but when you look at the farmers that we work with in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Peru, in Ecuador, there's smallholder farmers that don't even never had the resources to buy fertilizer, so they're by default organic. So they were already very traditional practices, regenerative practice, if you will. So we don't get to see that that push towards regenerative in the vast majority of the farmers that we work with. And even in Colombia, I would say that the vast majority of the farmers have always been less intensive farmers than the norm in Colombia. So we don't see it, but we do see a lot of talk about it. And we see a lot of talk about, for example, biochar, which is something that also has a lot of different shades. But it's more the talk than the actual real commitment to regenerative agriculture. I couldn't agree more with the fact that it should be beneficial for the planet, for the farmer, for everybody to apply more regenerative practices. I don't think we need to have huge intensive farming in any sort of crop. There is a catch, there is a trade-off. By applying regenerative practices, there's going to be lower production. And that's when you start to ask yourself, well, you talk a lot about regenerative, but are you willing to pay more for that coffee? And that's when the answer is basically no. Why should I?
Why should I? Not as much inputs.
The farmer is the one that benefiting. Well, guess what? They're not really benefiting. And to be completely honest with you, the whole world benefits. Because carbon capture, which is basically the concept behind regenerative agriculture, is how to improve the soil so that you can capture more carbon and store it in the soil and for good use to the plant. That is a benefit for the whole world. And the carbon capture in the soil is way more effective than the carbon capture in the trees. So if we're talking about climate change, regenerative agriculture is doing a huge benefit for the entire world, not just the farmer.
Yeah, we're big advocates of it here. And for the record, the kind of biochar that we advocate for is through pyrolysis. It's the good stuff. It's the necessary stuff. All the workshops that we've funded around biochar is about biochar based on pyrolysis. What we're starting to see is so many charlatans out there that are trying to scam producers, get them to pay for certifications and do all the unnecessary stuff so that they can benefit, and the actual stakeholders is doing the opposite of what we're trying to achieve, which is stronger stakeholder relationships. And one of the team from Caravela, Pedro Manga, talks really eloquently about this on LinkedIn. Everyone should go follow him. He's really articulate about it, and he advocates for these kinds of things in a really great way. Because unfortunately, what we're starting to see is, because there's more money in coffee, people want to take everything that they can, and yet again, the producer's not going to get paid as much as they deserve. So,
yeah, we're advocates of that. If we all benefit, including the farmer, and more importantly, the farmer, we're up for it. But if it's just about marketing gimmick, how somebody just one-sided kind of stakeholder involvement, then we're not up for it.
We're not in.
That's not who we want to support and be part of.
Yeah, I love it. I'm very aligned on that perspective of things. And just a tiny little message there's a couple businesses out there that use this podcast to scout for people who they can try and scam. I really want to caution you from that behavior. I'm on to you. I know exactly who you are, and I am watching very, very carefully. So, it's not going to happen. That's now on record as me saying that. So anyway, final episode. Join us as we talk about the next 18 months. This is where predictions are going to happen. So join us for the final episode of this series. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. This episode is part of a 5-part series produced by Mapper Forward. Check the full playlist and guest details in the show notes, as well as how you can support our work in the coffee industry. Become a premium YouTube subscriber, explore our Patreon and any brands we've partnered with to bring you this podcast. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really does help us grow our audience.